Hello, good evening. Welcome to Anna Heringer's lecture. I would like to introduce Anna Heringer by way of a few episodes in the history of art and architecture in Germany. The first episode is that of Gottfried Semper. When Gottfried Semper saw the Caribbean hut in the Great Exposition of 1851, following the lineage of Vitruvius and Laugier, he began to look at the primitive hut to find the origins of architecture through an anthropological lens. So instead of finding this universal theory of architecture through type, he was looking at assemblies and systems. So in the same year when he published The Four Elements of Architecture, he was equating the mound of the primitive hut to the trade of earthwork. He was equating the roof to the trade of carpentry, the enclosure to textiles, and then the hearth to ceramics. I think a particular note is the distinction between stereotomic construction for the base versus the tectonic construction of the roof, which one could build an entire architecture out of. The second episode, if we fast forward a bit more than 100 years, we have Frei Otto, the master of tensile and membrane structures, who built the Olympic Stadium in Munich in 1972, together with Günter Behnisch, which was also a building that was only built out of mounds from the rubbles of the war and the roof. But what of particular interest, I think, is when Frei Otto headed the Institute of Lightweight Structures at the University of Stuttgart in 1964, where he, together with studying the most advanced structures or advanced enclosure systems, he was also looking into ancient building techniques and indigenous building techniques, and published a very important book on bamboo, for example. Frei Otto is someone who encouraged new forms of social interaction. Instead of formal teaching plan, he always tried to foster open discussion and interdisciplinary research groups to engender new forms of social interaction. When asked to describe this lightweight institute, Frei Otto affectionately referred to it as the Spinner Zentrum, playing with this double meaning of the word spinner in German, which could mean crazy people, but also people that spin connections and webs. The third episode is of Joseph Beuys, the German fluxes, happenings, and performance artist who was influenced by Rudolf Steiner, and like Frei Otto, developed his courses in Düsseldorf on the spot in collaboration with the students. His pedagogy included these so-called open ring discussions, where students are grouped together to discuss political and philosophical issues together with artistic practices. So since the early 1970s, Joseph Beuys has seen education as a form of social sculpture and art. Another thing that is apparent in Beuys' work is he often combined this type of conflicting raw materials together. So he would combine electricity with animal fat, felt with batteries, wire cables with stone. And he always talked about energy. I think there's underlying belief in this group of work in the primal and transformative power of energy. And then he used energy as a metaphor for the creative and spiritual energy that art could foster or should foster in the individual and the society as a whole. So I believe Anna Heringer knows something of the above. I think her interest in tectonics, in social interaction, in energy belongs to a long cultural tradition. In both her METI Handmade School, built in Bangladesh in 2005, that won the Aga Khan Award, to the vocational school, the extension of the METI School. Conventional indigenous building techniques has been improved and transformed with a combination of modern knowledge, and both projects are, this exemplify the Semperian distinction of the stereotomic and the tectonic. And certainly a lot has happened since Anna lectured here in 2013. I look forward to see her work, such as the bamboo hostels in Longchuan in China. Reminded me a lot of Vladimir Shukov's radio towers, and also takes the stereotomic and tectonic relationship from the section to the plan. I look forward to learn more about the Dd Textiles Project, which is a textile initiative that allows women to earn a living in their villages without working in inhumane conditions in big factories, where it's truly a form of social architecture. I think looking at Anna's work, there's always this lingering and eternal question of the relationship between the noble savage and civility. and the question of how one could bring these methods and ethos one learned from the developing world back to the first world, where it's oftentimes encumbered with bureaucracies, liabilities, and processes. But I look forward to see Anna answer this question through her expanding repertoire of work and practice. Anna Heringer is the Honorary Professor, UNESCO Chair of Earthen Architecture, Construction Cultures, and Sustainable Development. And this semester, she's the Aga Khan Design Critic here at the GSD. So please join me to welcome Anna Heringer.
Thank you, Mark. That was wonderful. Thank you. Hello, GSD. Yeah, it's always a bit tricky to be in my studio. I think some who have, especially the studio trips, can be tough at times. Not only this year's students had experienced that in Bangladesh, but also my students at ETH Zurich some years ago, 2 years ago. It was the end of October. It was in the mountains in Austria. It was really cold. You see it a bit, how the people are dressed. And at 3 in the afternoon, we told them we had not booked any hostel or hut or any sort of accommodation for the night. And it was totally on purpose, not on mistake, since they all were supposed to be architects. One day, it was the challenge to build a hut or a shelter for one night. Well, the reactions were a bit mixed. So you had those kind of outdoor freaks, of course, in Switzerland, yeah, we're gonna build a hut like we did when we were young, and then we can even sleep there. And then there were like the middle part, they were thinking, yeah, there must be a plan B, but there wasn't. And then the third part was like utterly shocked, but everyone did it and everyone survived. Me too. It was really cold. It was really not comfortable at all, but it was a great learning experience. It was actually what we found out, that there are a lot of resources given by nature, and all you need is the sensitivity to see it and the creativity to use it. So I found myself in a pretty similar situation when I was in Bangladesh, in the village called Rudrapur. I had lived there before when I was 19 years old as a development learner at the NGO Deepshika. And what I had learned during my year in Bangladesh was that the most sustainable and most effective strategy for development is to really look at the potentials that you have existing and try to make the best out of it, and not trying to get depending on external factors. And then 7 years later, I tried to transform this philosophy into architecture. And in terms of materials, I didn't have to look far. What was there was just below my feet. It was the mud, the dirt, and the bamboo that was just growing all around. And in terms of energy, it was the people. And those were happy to have work opportunities on the school. So we also had very limited tools, but we had water buffaloes that were actually great for mixing, really great mixing machine. We had also tried it with cows before, but apparently they were too intelligent. They were always kind of stepping elegantly in the holes of the previous round, and they just wouldn't mix the straw, the mud, and the water, which is the ingredients of the mix. So then the mix comes on top of a foundation out of bricks. And the bamboo is all coming from the direct surrounding, as well as the workers that were all from the village and from the neighboring village. And we had also a team of craftsmen there, from like my cousin, from Anna Heringer and his wife, Stephanie. And I had also a colleague, Eike Roswag, an architect from Berlin, who was my realization partner. So after 6 months, the school looked like that. And it's really load-bearing earth walls that kind of give the very protective feeling inside. And then we have the opposite, the light kind of structure of the bamboo. I wanted to show this, what you can do out of these very local basic materials, that it's not only possible to build small, dark huts, but really also large structures. So the drawings were very simple. That was my diploma project at the University of Arts in Linz. I felt actually pretty uneasy when I handed in my thesis because I felt it's so basic, it's so simple, the design. I also didn't get the very best mark. Never mind. But the thing was that I really concentrated on very archaic needs. So I was trying to remember the spaces that I liked when I was a kid, and that's just, hiding behind bushes, having these cave situations, and this very protective, intimate situation that I put in the caves. And then the other part is like going up and having the overview and the treehouse kind of situations. And I think when you really deal with very archaic notions, then it doesn't make a difference between a Bavarian child and a Bangladeshi child. And I think it works out pretty well. So this is the ground floor. People are used to sit on the ground in the rural areas in Bangladesh, and we kept this tradition. And through these boat holes, you come into the cave areas. And that is really used for all sorts of purposes, especially, it's this kind of philosophy of the METI School is that children are giving time, to find their own pace in learning. So if some children are already done with a task, they can just grab a book and go into the caves and do their own separate learning, and they're not disturbing the others or making them nervous that they should push harder to also finish the task. And what is a nice situation here is that you're kind of in a separate place, but you still have the connection to the classroom. And that's kind of, I think, when we remember the childhood spaces, it's always the most interesting when you're yourself protected, but you can kind of have the full overview of what's going on elsewhere, but you're kind of in a hidden situation. So this is what happens here. And then on the top roof, you have more the airy kind of feeling. The children all signed with their names on the doors, and they also signed as authors because they were every afternoon they were on the site and helping us building. We had especially a team of Montessori teachers with us who were there only to include the students in the building process. And I think that's a very humane notion that, even if you're small and if you're weak, you want to be part of the real life, you want to be needed. And with mud, you can really, that's the nice thing, it's a very inclusive material. You can involve even children, and it's just a nice feeling when you remember how it is to play with the clay. So it is just ceramics in a slightly different scale. But it's a wonderful material to play with and to really build with, and the children felt extremely empowered. Just imagine if you're a small boy or a girl or a day laborer who had never had the chance to be in a school in his entire life. So standing after 6 months in front of that school and knowing that you built it with nothing but your hands and the dirt underneath your feet, that gives an enormous boost in self-confidence. It's just really so empowering to the people, and not only, in your own potentials, but also in the team around you, and of course also in the local materials. So especially mud and bamboo have a very bad image. In Bangladesh, it's considered as a non-durable material and the material of the poor. In fact, mud remains a very long time. Even the buildings that are a few hundred years old. There are some rules that you have to follow. First rule is a good foundation. Second rule is a good roof, so that the water cannot penetrate from ground or from the top. And the third rule is erosion control. So just as a hill needs rocks or trees in order to slow down the pace of the water so that the erosion is not going deep, also the wall needs kind of speed breakers so that the speed of the water is slowed down. So on a bigger level, you have this kind of speed breakers here on the facade, and on a micro level you have kind of straw inserted, or also when you have rammed earth you have stones, so that gives a certain roughness on the facade after a few months, and this roughness is all you need so that the facade is really kind of self-healing. So the walls are standing strong after many monsoon rains and also horizontal monsoon rains. They turn a bit rougher, but they are extremely strong, and there's no cement in it except in the foundation. And for me, that's very important not to add any aggregates, because the mud is the only building material you can take from nature, can recycle 100 times without any quality loss, and can give it back to nature and build a garden on top of it. And that's for me a very important and powerful thing when it comes to sustainability. In terms of economic sustainability, it was for me very interesting that I was more or less living on the site, and in the evening I would go with the workers to the market, and I could see how they spent the money that they just got every day. So they would buy the vegetables from the neighbors, or they would get a new haircut or a blouse for the wives. So it was really, the money, the building budget became really a catalyst for the whole village and rural development there. And if I had built the school with cement or in steel, this money would have been exported, and they would have nothing left for the community. And that was the part that made me most happy, that this project is not just a school building, it is really a catalyst for development for the people. Yeah, the school got the Aga Khan Award, and that enabled or helped me to go on in my way, in my path, and I could do the next project there, which is the Deshi building, a vocational training for electrical students there in Rudrapur. And you have classrooms, but you also have teacher offices and also living residential units. For me, important was that we go 2 stories with the mud, because Bangladesh is extremely dense populated, so scarcity of land is very immense there and very vital. And still, I mean, millions of people are living in the rural areas, and most of them just in single-story houses. And I was thinking, if it just could top 1 floor, it would save so much more space for food cultivation, which is really needed there. I also wanted to bring in more craftsmanship, because traditional crafts and the know-how is also dying out. Even, you know, the plastic buckets from China are becoming cheaper and more attractive than the woven bamboo baskets, for example. So in order to kind of push a bit the know-how, we just used the basket weaving in a bigger scale. And that's the spaces inside. That's, I think, from all the spaces that I built in Bangladesh, the most favorite of the people there. It's like this kind of, it's a very poetic space. So it's the veranda. Normally, what you would do in a context like Germany, or probably also the States, you would make a bigger interior and a small balcony. In Bangladesh, in that climate, you make a small interior and a large veranda. So because in that climate, you just like to be outside. So, and that's what I kind of did. I did a reinterpretation of the Bangladeshi Courtyard. And that drawings actually were the actual drawings for the site. So when I started building, I had no elevation, I had no cross-section, and I had no details. I just had a feeling in my belly how this building could look like in the end. And then I would just sit every day after, you know, working on the site. I would sit down and do the next sketch for the next days. And that was, for me, the best part of working. I would love to do projects again without any computer, without anything, just with following the intuitive feeling, and of course in very close dialogue with the craftsmen. Because I knew the craftsmen also from the METI School project. I knew what they could do, and that just helped in the process a lot. And of course, I was there all the time. But I felt more like a conductor, you know, when I could give space to the craftsmen to bring in their own ideas, and I could just moderate more. And then I knew when I had to step in and take the lead again. And it was a very dynamic process and very participatory. Yeah, now a part comes of the things that did not work out, which you usually don't hear in lectures, but I think it's very, for me, it was, of course, the biggest learning experience is the things that don't turn out the way you want to. So what you see here, you see a little bit of a different kind of color in the mud. This is because it's wet, because the entire top floor had to be replaced, because I had no idea as a Bavarian what a good bamboo is and what not. So also the farmers found out that I had no idea about it, and they just brought me, the super nice green, fresh, sugary bamboo, and that was a big party for the Beatles, who loved the sugar in the bamboo. So after a few years, I got a phone call from the director of the METI School, said, "Hey, Anna, we have a problem. The bamboo is breaking down," and I got totally mad. It's such a shock. It's the first project, it's always a baby. You feel very emotional towards a project like this, and then you think, my God, this building is having cancer, and it felt like I couldn't sleep anymore. I couldn't eat anymore. I stepped on the next plane to Bangladesh, went there, and it was really interesting. The workers were, everyone in Bangladesh was completely cool about it. They said, first, vulnerability is part of life. It's the decay. It's kind of a normal thing, and it's also there are a lot of Hindus there, which was for me interesting that they built their goddesses every year out of mud, out of clay, and then they return it to the water every year, while we built everything in gold and in the most durable materials. It is the holy statues, they go into the water in the cycle every year. So I found it also, this mentality is different than ours, and I think it's something we definitely can learn from. And then the next thing they said, we have the know-how. We did the METI School, we did the Deshi building, we know how to do this structure. The only thing is what we need, we need the bamboo. So, okay, I organized the bamboo. And then they said, I thought I would need an engineer, how to get this thing down without any crane, without any scaffolding and everything, and to get it up again. But they said, no, you go home, we do that. And that's what they did. So I was not there. No one was there. They just did it entirely on their own. And they passed on the know-how from one generation to the next. We now grow our own bamboo. That's what we learned. We have our own bamboo forest now. And for me, what I understood is, that's actually the happy end. They gave this to my daughter. And when you look closely, every lashing is just perfectly done. Every dowel is sitting on the right position. That's what they just did in one evening. So they really inhaled the structure. And it's such a good feeling as an architect when you see, okay, your job is done. You're not needed anymore. It's actually really nice, except the design, the proportions is a bit... But in terms of techniques, that was the best compliment I could get, that they really have inhaled the know-how. And I understood that, we always think we have to build for eternity. For us, the material level is so important. But actually, which is much more important is the know-how that we're leaving behind. And I think for me, I'm meanwhile really okay if my buildings go back to nature one day. And I really don't think that I'm so important that my buildings have to stand forever. If they're needed, they will be rebuilt. And the know-how will be passed on from one generation to the next. But I think that's the important thing, that we really build and create knowledge and not just waste. And I also understood is that the core problem of sustainability is how we deal with the fear of decay and death. And that's probably something that is, especially in our society, a big taboo. But death is part of nature, and that's just something we have to respect. And embracing vulnerability. For me, vulnerability in the beginning, it was difficult to deal with it. But meanwhile, it's a great source of creativity, because every material is different wherever I go, plus every climate is different, and the materials are vulnerable towards the climate. Like when I don't add any stabilizers in the mud is water resolvable. So it's vulnerable. So I have to change my architectural language and really kind of tailor it to the place, that is really absolutely made for that place, for that climate, with that local materials. And that gives two great parameters, the climate and the local materials, with what is really great to work with. And the byproduct is a very authentic and very unique architecture that you cannot place from one place to the next. So in that way, I think all the buildings that I'm doing are looking different, because my architectural language is created out of this vulnerability of these materials. And that's for me a great source of creativity. yeah, that's how the METI School is looking right now. They painted, it was a mistake that they painted all the doors in red, and when we were there with the students, we painted it back, and everyone was pretty happy that it's back in colors. Yeah, we kind of posed with the Aga Khan Award. Yeah, so this is the master plan. So that was the first building, second building, and now this one is under construction, which is called Anandaloy. It is a building for a center for people with disabilities. And also the shape is kind of unusual. I didn't want to make another box. I wanted to make a building that is kind of dancing, just to show, you know, it's good that we are not all a box, the kind of functional box, that it's good that there are parts of our society that is kind of not in line and are different, and that it's beautiful to be different. And this is what I hope that as this building is kind of articulating, and also the ramp is going all around. It's you know, it's very visible, the ramp, because that's kind of the symbol of inclusion there. And on the top floor, we're thinking, you know, it would be nice not just to make a place for healing, but also a place for, you know, to give the people a future and to add a place where they could actually also work. So we combined it with a project, yeah, that's the elevation. We combined it with a project, it's called Dd Textiles, that I initiated with a tailor master in my hometown, Veronica Lang, and also with the women of Deep Shika that got tailoring training. And what we are trying, I was always fascinated from the very first time I was there, from these beautiful textiles that were just hanging out for drying all the time. And when you look close, they have really wonderful, vibrant surfaces. And I thought, you know, well, we always, when we think of Bangladesh and textiles in Bangladesh, we think of these stupid T-shirts. Well, they have such a fantastic culture, textile culture there. So why don't we do something, design a project or an object that can be produced in a decentralized way, so that we enable women to stay within the village, so they don't have to live in situations like this. They don't have to migrate into the urban areas and into the textile hubs where the living conditions and working conditions are really hard. So instead, they can stay within their village where they have this network. They can take full advantage of you know, all the generations that are living there. The women feel safe because they know each other. They can move around. So the kind of free space, the freedom is much more higher, and the independence than living in the urban areas. So that was also the topic of the last Biennale, free space, and we presented the Dd Textiles there. Yeah, and this is the foundation work when we were there on the studio trip, and we had the first mud mix, the official inauguration of the mud. These, I really love the water buffaloes. We also gave them names, both starting with M. I'm not gonna continue. That is a kind of top secret within our studio. But it could be some similarities with some personalities here at the GSD. But they are really great guys. They were hard workers. And then we had the official opening ceremony. Do we have the sound with a very beautiful song of Tagore? It was a very moving ceremony. It was also so nice to see like this different also religions coming together with this very strong culture. And we also understood the meaning of culture. You know, when we were just before in the camps, where culture was almost absent. It was so healing also to see how uniting a strong cultural identity can be amongst religion.
Thank you, ভাই।
So there's also a lot of GSD meanwhile in the mud wall there. Yeah, it's growing. And completely alone. I mean, no one is there from my team. It's just the workers there. It's under the guidance of Martin Rauch. Yeah, still, mud is my big passion. Almost 3 billion people on this planet are living in mud buildings. It's always seen as a super small niche. In fact, it's really a large scale that we are dealing with. And it's so important to scale it up that the numbers are not decreasing but increasing, because it's a material that is everywhere available, that needs a lot of labor, and we have 7 billion people. I mean, we need work opportunities for 7 billion people. And it doesn't need CO2. I mean, that's the perfect kind of material that we need for the future. But we definitely need more to scale it up. And that's also the topic of a new book I just wrote with Lindsay Blair Hauer and Martin Rauch. It's published with GTA Verlag and coming in spring, next spring. It's going to be on the market. And of course, we talk a lot about of development of technologies like prefabrication, but also the meaning of education. And I'm really glad that at the GSD we can talk about mud and we can do tests and we can really get hands-on experience, because with mud it's like learning skiing. You can't do it on a just theoretical level. You also have to learn it in a practical way. Yeah, we also did projects together with Martin Rauch at the ETH Zurich. I had a studio with him 2 years ago, and we did prototype houses for orphans there, but also a community hall, which is currently still under construction. And of course, we are also dealing with mud in our current studio, which is dealing with the Rohingya crisis in Bangladesh. It's currently the largest refugee camp in the world. It's about 1 million people, and it's just, the moment is just breathtaking when you're standing there and you see this sheer endless camp, and it's just, this dimension of tragedy is just really hard to take. So this is the situation that just goes endlessly. And it's a very vulnerable situation. I mean, cyclones are coming, flood is coming, and of course it's surrounded in a region and in a country that is already extremely poor, and land is so scarce. So it's really a very problematic situation there. So we took time to discover the camp with OBAT helpers, who were our partners there, which are really doing great work. And that is now part of one of the students of Tommy Schapakotter's research in the studio. So we looked at the materials, or he looked into the materials that are coming into the camp. And it's mainly a tarpaulin, of course, rope material, and bamboo, which is there. You see it all the time. So you have structures out of bamboo and then kind of covered with the plastic sheets. So if you compare the inorganic material and the organic material that are coming into the camp, it's just 22% is, or 29% is inorganic. The rest is organic. The rest is inorganic, which means in the end also waste. And if we look particularly on the material of the walls, of course, for the roofing, you need plastic, you need tarpaulins. But what's astonishing, that also the wall materials are mainly built out of this kind of plastic sheets. and only a very small part is building with mud. And the situation in reality is like this. They're really sitting on the building material. I mean, the mud is just so there. So, and it's just such a weird situation. If you think the material is there, the labor is there, so, and also people start on their own building with the mud, but those who have been there since a longer time in Bangladesh and have already seen the Bangladeshis working with the mud, because the Rohingyas itself, they come more from the timber structures. But still, it's like, if we think of the durability of materials, mud can be very durable, but it can also return to nature, so it doesn't leave any imprint in the place. But it's like when we see all the other materials that are coming in, they have, are all oil-based. They have millions of years kind of embedded in their character. But in fact, the durability is, the guarantee is not more than a year. I mean, they can stay longer, but it's only a year that the guarantee is on. So in a way, you bring in millions of years but they are not very permanent. They leave a lot of waste. On the other hand, you are sitting on a material that is there for free, and that doesn't leave any scars. So that's why we really hope that we can do something with our project there, to bring up new visions, how to really use the existing local materials. So we were working with the bamboo structures to understand the bamboo structures more, and then we were also getting ourselves into the dirt and understanding the mix that is there, the qualities, what you can actually build with that material. So it's definitely not usable for rammed earth, but for various other techniques that we did here, like kind of reinforcing, that were projects from Obat that were starting to use the mud, and we gave in our input, especially Martin Rauch's input, how to fortify these structures. And, especially also how to deal with surfaces. And it gave us also a really nice way to interact with the community.
No, but they understand this.
And what we understood is, it's such a harmful or painful situation. If you're sitting in the camp and you have nothing to do, you're not needed, especially as a child. What kind of future is that? And if they were just passing by and they were really happily joining in and doing something. And I think that is also, mud is often used in therapies, how to overcome traumata. And 70% of the kids have experienced either murder or rape, and mostly also of their own parents. So they are highly traumatically shocked and have really painful experience. And I think this kind of process could be really also healing if you're not just sitting and being kind of forced to wait for help from outside, but you can actually build something out of the ground, while the process itself is forming community, is healing for yourself. You feel powerful again, because when you build the wall, when you build the house, you feel empowered. And I think that's a very important notion that has not yet really been implemented. And that's what we are trying to hope to contribute with the studio. We asked the children to draw the dream houses, and they were all drawing the houses they left in Burma. And we also asked them if they could imagine, to live in mud houses. They were all saying, no, we don't want to live in mud houses. And then they were like, we showed them a book from an Indian colleague, Dd Constructor, who did beautiful mud houses, and they were all, wow, this is beautiful. And then we were asking, do you know what material this is? They said, yes, it's METI, it's mud. And then we were asking them, can you imagine that you built this here in the camp? I said, yes, we can. And that was such a good feeling for us to see. Also, the adults were saying the same, that it's giving vision. And that's the important thing, to really show a scenario, a future vision, how this settlement could really grow out of the dirt. So this is some scenes from our studio that also slightly transformed already. So we're trying to build a center for children. Most of the projects are that kind of influence as a kind of a powerful first iconic building that kind of gives the know-how to the people, training to the people, and so that it can kind of influence the whole settlement, but in a very kind of more acupuncture trigger point kind of system. And that was just something that I found that I wrote in a diary some years ago, and I think that is still also relevant in this situation, is a person who lives in a beautiful, unique environment with a strong cultural identity, where she or he can actively participate and find work in creating it, is likely at risk to fall towards ideological fundamentalism in the search for meaning. And this kind of fundamentalism is definitely something that is a danger in the camps. Of course, they have nothing to hold on except the religion, and and have all this kind of pain inside, and that often comes out, of course, in an aggressive kind of movement. Yes, I believe that the time of star architects is over, but I still believe that we need iconic buildings that kind of give directions and show some visions. And I was invited in China, now we jump from Bangladesh to China, in a bamboo biennale that invited several architects, amongst them also Kenko Kuma, Simon Welles, and so on, to show the beauty of bamboo. So I designed 3 hostels. And while going to the village, we passed cities like this, and for me it was a very shocking moment, also knowing that China within just a handful of years consumed more cement than the United States in the last century. It's just such an enormous, and it's not just China, that's happening all over the world, and people have been living in houses made out of natural materials before, and this kind of increase of CO2 emissions at global scale in all parts of the world is just a trend that we cannot continue, and that we need some alternatives for that. And bamboo and mud are certainly very important material for that, also of course timber. So just the drawings, I designed kind of a core, a double core with the staircase and all the utility, like toilets and a lobby, toilet, showers. And then attached to this kind of core, out of rammed earth and stone, you have like concons. These are the sleeping units for the boys and the girls in that hostel. And it's kind of a vertical tent camp in a way. But it's also, it's a little bit like the Chinese lampshades in the night when they start to gloom then. It was totally new for me because I don't like symmetry much, but I felt like, in that project and also in that cultural context, the center was something very important. So I started to really go into this kind of central and symmetric kind of things, which ultimately became really a little bit of a meditation. That was the stone pattern. That was the floor plan of the guest house. The rooftop. Yeah, first, when I was on the site, those images came somehow, and I thought, yes, I want to have this kind of expressive shapes there. And then I was thinking, how do I do this with the insulation? How do I do it with the climate? And since I started in Austria, they were we had very strict teachers in terms of, the climatic performance of the buildings. And I thought this needs way too much resources, to pack this whole sculpture into some kind of insulation material. And then I started observing the people, and first I thought, it's a kind of a strange fashion. And then I understood that it's kind of, they're living in cold houses, but they have the insulation just really thick around them. So they don't insulate the house, but they insulate the bodies. And then they heat up with soups, with teas, and so on. I thought, with a youth hostel, I can maybe also be a little bit more experimental in terms of comfort. So I thought, well, I heat up, the lobby room that also heats up the water for the showers then. And then there's a gong in the evening, and people get kind of the heating source directly on their body. Then they go into the kind of tents and they insulate their bodies with the heating source in kind of a good sleeping bag. So they sleep in a cold room, but they have the heating source around the body and the insulation, so it's pretty healthy. And in summer, I thought they could just, open the concon. They had like just a mosquito net inside, and then they had the fresh air. That didn't totally work out, unfortunately. But what worked out is the really beautiful bamboo weavings that they did so fantastically. Yeah, for me it was important, when we think of sustainability, we always think we are limited in resources. But actually, when we build with materials that are there in abundancy, like bamboo or earth, then we can actually really also build those structures without harming. So I'm also, meanwhile, working into more smaller scale or interior projects. It was a project I did with Martin Rauch in a company building in Austria. And for us, it was a challenge to bring it's in a kind of interior courtyard. It's kind of the hangout areas for the employees. It's a kind of high-tech company with a lot of kind of techie freaks working there, and we brought in kind of a total opposite, a total low-tech material, but they're supporting a lot of projects in developing countries, and there were also some of my projects in Zimbabwe, the kindergarten, and also in Bangladesh. So they wanted to have a kind of atmosphere of these buildings in their headquarters. And Martin and I, we wanted to do the experiment of the very basic building techniques. It's called the tabur technique, basically taking the wet clay and shaping it with your own hands in the European context, and how that works out. So we designed it and then we built it. Like, it's more or less like ceramics, you just do this kind of sausages, one layer after the other. So it's actually the same thing, only 2 stories. And yeah, my daughter is also, it's the same. I'm not just letting the Bangladeshi kids work. Also, my daughter loves to be on site. Although it's completely illegal, it's not nice, actually. I mean, in our society, we tend to amuse the children afar from the real life, but actually children want to be part of it and want to be needed. And it's actually, it's just a nice material to work with. So we did it very basic. And of course, we could have done it with a 3D plotter. I mean, it's easy to do the things, but it's such a joy, and it gives you such a connection. And we were thinking, that is actually a point that is missing in our society. We are not making things anymore, and this joy in really being involved and feel, how your physical pressure is actually shaping the architecture and shaping the spaces. This is a joy I would never give into the hands of a robot or of a plot or whatever. This is, and we were really stressed. We had tough time scheduling and everything, but once we had the hands in the mud and once we were doing these things, we felt really like the mind got a relief. And this is a point that we are losing in our parts of the society. We are giving the nicest parts away, and I think that's something we have to bring back in a way again. And these shapes are just coming, you're there, and then you're pressuring the mud, and then it's following your real energy. And for me, that's the ultimate architecture. You build this thing and you're really into the structure. You touch every single centimeter of that building, and that is giving you a very strong connection. So this is kind of the down. It's not that low tech as it looks. It has like the there is cooling in the floor, it's heating in the benches. This is the automatic airflow, the light, and then the sound system is also there. Then the whole structure is activated in terms of heating and cooling, and also the mud itself is also balancing the indoor humidity in a natural way very perfectly. So it has these high-tech elements, although the technique itself is very low-tech. And what we found out, or what is the outcome of testing this very basic building technique in the European context, is that it's almost unaffordable. And that's kind of really makes me very sad. If you think you just take the local material, the mud, and shape it with your own body, that in our economic system, this is almost unaffordable. Although this building material is healthy for people, is healthy for the planet, and is creating jobs, so also healthy for the society, why a building method is kind of punished with a higher price? There's something wrong with our economic system, definitely, because that shouldn't be the case, you know. And I really very much hope that we will get a carbon tax soon, because that would set things into the right balance again. And I think, you know, capitalism is man-made, is not a force of nature, and it's also time to change that. Yeah, so I'll run you through some of the, I believe that we, you know, whenever I design, I think, you know, it's not a sustainability that works, or an architectural approach that works for Bangladesh but not for Germany, or it would maybe work for developing country but not for the industrialized one. I think there's one sustainability, one approach. I think that's a global one, because if something is exclusive, if something is just affordable for one part of the society or for one part of the world's population, then it can't be really on a social level be sustainable. We are one planet. We are just doesn't make sense to make different kind of grades of sustainability. So wherever I work with the same approach, looking at the local materials that are existing, the local energy resources that are existing, and then adding global creativity, because I think like creativity, know-how should not be limited in a place. That should be kind of coming in from a global scale and then applied to local conditions. So I just run you through some of the projects I'm doing, partly alone, partly with Martin Rauch and others together. I always use the technique of clay storming. So we really design the projects on large clay models. That was a horse stable in Spain, and that's how we usually start a project. We think, you know, how many square meters, how much volume we need in the mud, and then we start shaping it. That's ecotourism project in our eco farm in Austria. So this is how the project is developing, and that's the final state. Looks quite Austrian. So then also when I go on the site, I first see what kind of material is there, what kind of techniques people are using. This is in central India. So they use the same technique just that we did before in Austria without any formwork. So it's, again, the volumes in the beginning. And then we started twisting the mud. And when you don't need a formwork, you can actually shape it in any way you want. So that is a campus for university, the accommodations for faculty and also students. And that is also ecotourism permaculture project in Spain, again in Andalusia. And we also look a lot into, you know, the pattern language. So to try, you know, because it's whenever we go on holidays, we try to go to exactly these spaces, you know, like Greece or whatever, Italy, where we have these beautiful spaces, and we just would love to bring that kind of quality also back into this kind of project. So we sometimes, you know, we just carve out actually the places rather than the buildings. and that is a project I'm currently working on. So with Köhler Architekt and Zeller Romstädter Architekt is my first commission in Germany. I'm totally happy about that. And that was I think it's the second public building in Germany where the call was for an earth building. So that the call for architects was already, so that was clear that it's gonna be an earth building. And this kind of push from politics, or also that was from the church, I think is needed, that that there's something going on, and that really good landmark projects are being implemented, so that that are pushing again the levels of regulations and so on new levels. So this was also a participatory approach. Even the cook, the chef, and the teachers were participating in that. And it's gonna be a kindergarten. It's the first part that is implemented, then a center for sustainability, and that's a boarding school, and that thing is existing. Last project I'm gonna showing is in Worms in Germany. It's a 1,000-year-old cathedral. It was the anniversary, and for this anniversary, they got a new altar, or they had a competition for a new altar that I did with Martin Rauch. So the interior is incredible. It's Balthasar Neumann, and also the cathedral itself is a very historic spot in Germany. It's like a lot of history is linked to that cathedral. So it's a very sensitive place. And we didn't want to just design objects. We thought, what we can learn from projects like the METI School in Bangladesh is that the process is just as important as the outcome. And in former times, communities, cities were coming together, creating a church, building up a church or a school or whatever public buildings. And that really united the people, because you cannot build the building alone. You have to come together as a city to manage large-scale projects. And that really, this kind of coming together and implementing something together is a very powerful element that we have lost in our societies, that we have given away to contractors. And this is something I think we have to gain back. So we decided, we built the altar out of mud. We don't prefabricate it and bring it there, but the whole community is coming together to build it. So this really extremely, that's the center, that's the most holiest place in the cathedral. We turned into a construction site for a week. And then people were coming. We had the material in front of the Imperius Gate, and then it was coming in with wheelbarrows. And then the ramming started. Yeah, and then people started to bring in own elements. They had, some were like historic from the Roman times, stones, and then they started, seeds bringing in, or like amulets that they had. Someone was coming. He said, "Oh, I'm from France, and I was a soldier in Algeria, and my mother gave me that kind of amulet in the wartime. It protected me, and now I want to give it, have it presented there." And then the Indian nuns that were feeling totally homesick. I had brought also a piece of Indian earth, so they were putting it in. They were starting to cry, and you could really feel that mud is the earth is much more just a building material. It's such an emotional element as well. And then kids were coming in, and yeah, we had from all over the world. We had mud coming in, and then kids were coming and mixing the mud, and they just, for some had first time the hands in the mud, and it was really a great experience for them. And then they were stamping with their feet in the formwork. And then that was the moment where kind of we took off the formwork, and just before we took it off, I felt like, the shape and how it went out, how it looks, wasn't so much important anymore. It was already such a powerful experience, the whole process, that of course it matters as much as the process, but normally it was just turning things around, because normally you all wait, how does it look like? You want to have that picture, you want to have this, beautiful object, but it was just so clear in that moment that the process is just as important. Yeah, everyone was really extremely happy. Also, the priest, Probst Schäfer, he was in the beginning, he wasn't very sure about this project. I think he was also the second proposal was a proposal out of steel, and I think he also liked that one very much. But then he found in the Bible a quote where Moses, when he received the 10 commandments, he also received the prescription from direct order how to build the altar, and it was said it should be made out of mud. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, there's so much going on here. There's such, the looseness is there, and I think this is a symbol also a bit of our society. We're not lacking of materials, but what we are lacking is relationships and sense and meaning. And I think that is kind of the symbol of the altar. It brings us back, to the essence, and what really matters is also relationships and meaning. Yeah, the inauguration is, or the blessing is next week with the bishop and everything. I'm looking forward to that moment. Yeah, that picture is for me a very important one, this alpha and omega, that what I said before. I think to truly build sustainable, we have to also kind of embed it, the omega. When we design buildings and objects, we should already design how it can go back to the ground, to the nature again. And I think the most important thing for me in my work is raising trust in many levels, in the own potentials. That you can really get rid of the strife of all the ego, leave space also for intuition. That you have everything inside. You don't need all whatsoever plotters, programs, whatever. We are getting so much depending. In fact, we need creativity, we need intuition, and we have to give space to that. And I think that can create sometimes also very surprising architecture. And of course, also on the level of society, the trust, I think, is very important that we bring participation into our projects again. And I think this is bringing much. Of course, maybe we have to compromise sometimes imperfection, but it brings back so much meaning and relationship to our projects that is, I think, very important in our society right now. And then, of course, trust in the local materials. All around us, we have just really beautiful materials, and we really need to use them in order to create a planet that is also there for the future generations. 500 years ago, we were able to do this. So with all our technology that we have, we should be able to do things again. I would love to build a skyscraper right in Manhattan. I think also for urban space is absolutely possible. So there are no limitations. There's a wide field open for innovation, because this field, modern architecture, has not been much discovered yet. So I hope a lot of colleagues join me in the thing to pushing things forward. And yes, I do believe architecture is a tool to improve lives, and a very powerful tool too. I think in the end of my career, when I'm adding up all the building budgets that run through my fingers, I really want to be able to tell myself that, I distributed the money in the right way, that it ended up with people, with craftsmen, and not just in big pockets of some industrialized, in some industries. And I want to tell myself that I contributed to social justice, to a cultural diversity, and I'm not leaving scars, but a garden behind. Yeah, architecture is a tool to improve lives, and I think we should use it with all the creativity that we have, with all our sensitiveness and also love, in order to make this place, the world, more better, more beautiful, and also more humane space. Thank you. Yeah, sure.
So we have time for a few questions for Anna. And so there are microphones. If you have questions, then we can pass along the mic.
Yes, of course. We tested the mod in Boston.
I remember when you had it up.
Yeah, it works. And of course, I mean, you can do it in load-bearing ways, but you can also do it a lot of inside with all the mud plastering. For me, it was totally weird. First time I was here as a Loeb Fellow, and we were all, in already furnished apartments, and I opened first time the cupboard. I thought, what kind of instruments are there in this cupboard? Until, I figured out these are humidifiers. I had never seen humidifiers before. I mean, it's for me totally weird to make walls that are completely sealed, that cannot breathe. And in winter you have to plug in these instruments that need a lot of electricity to get an indoor humidity that kind of is comfortable, while I have my humidifier is my mud wall at home. It's like, it's completely automatically and it's much more healthy. So I'm also living not in a total load-bearing mud house, because I'm living in a 500-year-old house, so I did a lot of inside. So there's a lot of hybrid versions also possible.
There might be some child labor laws here in Boston that prevent
Probably.
children. But there's another question.
Yeah, I'm just wondering how. Sorry. Like that was really great. I'm just wondering how you feel like this process is going to scale well into the larger projects you're starting to do now, and what considerations you're dealing with that, as well as they're in areas that have different labor laws and these kind of concerns.
Yeah.
Just maybe go deeper into that.
Thanks for this question. Yes, the good thing is with mod, you can do it very low-tech, but you can also do it high-tech. So Martin Rauch did for Herzog Dömeron this Ricola Herb Center in Switzerland, where the labor costs are extremely high. So there you have to find technologies where you can reduce the labor. So he just invented a lot of machinery that still needs more labor than a concrete wall, but it's much faster to do. It's prefabricated, so it's drying before you put it, and you just staple it on site. So you have like huge blocks of mud that you just then put on top of each other. And that is then, normally if you build it in situ on site, you have to wait after a certain height, until it dries out and it's stable again. So this all falls away. So you can really calculate the time on the site. It's much faster. And these elements have insulation in it. They can have all the electrical fittings in it. They have wall heating in it. So these kind of technologies are existing, and this is also needed in order to use it for urban places and for more industrialized countries.
I'm a current Loeb Fellow, so I can relate to your humidifier comment. I'm just wondering, in terms of the scalability and the camps that you showed, one of your early rules was that you needed this concrete foundation. So how can you address a city and, a kind of improvised city of 1 million people without concrete?
Yeah, the foundation is the only thing where it would make sense to get material in. Right now, the regulations in the camp are that there should be no lasting material there. So that means you have to make rammed earth foundations, which a lot of houses in Bangladesh do have, also some 2-story houses. It's not that strong like a brick foundation, but it's possible, it's doable. It just needs to be, a thick rammed earth foundation, and then the walls have to be also comparatively thick.
Hey, I think the work you do is really amazing in general, but I was curious, because you have kind of your fabric artisan world and then the building world, but do you ever use textiles for building or with the mud? Do you put the textiles in the mud?
Yeah, I think this one shows it, for example. So you mean
like
in
as
the
a
mud?
material,
No.
like as a building material?
No,
rather
as a
than
building
just as
material.
I
do it normally. I mean, the mud walls are really having this very heavy and steady feeling, kind of static one. And I love the textiles that are bringing like the playful and kind of also the kinetic element in it. So I use it more as a kind of counterpart and also to bring colors in, which is, I think, also important in the emotional part in buildings. But the mud walls itself, they work without the textiles, so, and it's just cheaper without.
Your projects. Can you speak a little more about the time restraints and considerations in your projects? Because it seems like, as you said, the walls need time to dry in a lot of the projects, as well as it's a major kind of community investment. So are they done over? I didn't quite grasp the time frame, how long these projects took. Was it something that was a year, or was it 2 years or 3 years?
No, the METI School was 6. After 4 months, it looked like this. Then it had a certain drying, and then there came the surfacing, putting on all the surfaces, fixing some cracks, and that took another 2 months. But there was a drying period in between. But this is done within altogether, I think, 9 months or so. I mean, that's definitely possible also but I think if you really want to speed up things, then prefabrication is the way to go. And then, it's like maybe it's a half a year of prefabrication, and then you install the elements depending on the size of the project. But I think Ricola, it took like 3 months or so, I think.
Hi, it's always wonderful to see your work. So inspiring. Can you speak a little bit about code regulations? Because I know that Martin also had problems, and he was able to do his house because, it was his own house. So doing this new project in Austria, did you have to go around or create new codes for mud buildings?
Yeah, that is, Germany is difficult, Switzerland is easier, Austria is also okay, Germany is bad. And now I'm having this project in Germany, but you have to do all the tests, making as if you invent a new building material. So you have to have all sorts of tests throughout the process, but it's possible. I mean, it takes time and it costs, which is again unfair, because why would that cost, but yeah. You have to add some costs and some time for that, but it's possible. I mean, of course you can do cubes and test these cubes with all sorts of pressures and tension and whatever with all these powers. This is not. I mean, if you invent some other materials, you have to go through this process as well. But it's definitely possible. But you need this kind of it's called. You get the certificate for this specific building. So it would be good to have like regulations with the codes. It's always then it forces you to build it exactly or to use the mud exactly like this. And if you want to use local mud that is kind of non-standardized and doesn't have again this kind of you have the patent on this specific mix. I mean, you want to have it a local material, and that's kind of the tricky thing. So it would be better to have kind of rules that you say, okay, if I'm not sure about it, if I follow the rules, I know it's safe. But if I know the material well, if I'm a good craftsman, or I just really know these things, then I can also go beyond the rules. It's not, strictly, it's not a code that I have to be exactly like this. Yeah?
Thank you. Did you face any cultural resistance to the notion of people living in mud homes? Hassan Fatih, who did the same thing in Egypt, they were seen as being of a lesser quality. They were seen as being not Western enough, not glitzy enough. Did you face any of that in any of your
all the
work?
Time, all the time.
Speak to how you got over that. Was that a Montessori
The only
process?
thing that helps is, a good design. It's beauty. That is, all the factors of sustainability, even costs, that is not interesting. But what's really the emotional factor is the factor of, if you always go for the beautiful thing, even if it's more expensive, if it doesn't make sense, whatever. But, this is the only thing what I've figured out. And no one wanted to have, in the beginning, the school built out of mud and bamboo. But then, it was like, but of course the NGO understood all the sustainability aspects that the people can learn techniques to improve their own living conditions. That was all understood, but still it was not really, you don't want to have that dirt. And then after seeing how beautiful it could look like, then of course the next projects are way more easier. But I mean, with the first building, I really had to do something that is a total no-go in development work, is like imposing things, you know, that, I mean, I collected the money, so I could, of course, steer in the direction I wanted to go. And that is, of course, a situation you never want to do in development work. You want to follow exactly the dreams of and aspirations of the people, you know. And I felt really bad about it. But I think it's, you know, this branding is going on all the time. It started already, you know, in the colonial times, where, you know, the British were bringing in the better bricks, you know, because they had the coal, so that was better quality. So they brought it. They built already with these things, you know, that. The more prominent building, then the whole development aid, all these decades of development aid, where the German engineers were coming and making proper structures, ignoring the local potentials, and then all the movies and all, you know, TV, all this branding is going on since decades, and so this is also a kind of an imposition. It's also not really respecting the local conditions. So in that thing, I thought it's important to just to put also an alternative on the table that is really people can see, people can touch and experience, to have a counterpart, to, you know, to see that it's something else is possible as well, not just small dark huts.
I mean, I just want to follow up on this gentleman's question, because I think your buildings serve the immediate purpose for the people in the program, but it also serves a purpose as a model. Huh? And I remember previous interviews you've done about the schoolhouses, where you talked about the importance of that this model needs to be close to reality. It's not something that's so foreign that people feel patronized by it, something that aspires. You know, and I think, can you talk, I'd be interested to hear you talk about this balance, because on one hand you talked about we over the stock-attack system, but people need iconic buildings. I think this gap between what one can do and what one can aspire to is a very important tightrope to walk.
I think that, you know, if it was only the METI School, I think it was very important to also make the second building, where it's about housing, where it was a big topic. For example, how do you bring showers into a mud building? How to bring toilets into a mud building? It was something no one could imagine how that could look like. Then also we did at the same time, we did some prototype houses in the village and neighboring villages with 2 stories with students. So to show all these kind of steps. So I think, you know, you can't, it's like doing a massage, you know, you have to find the trigger point and push that really hard, and that's the METI School, you know, and that's what we are also now trying to do in the studio with the Rohingyas, you know, we try to find this trigger point, and then, you know, find ways that people can actually use the know-how, you know, like they're getting hired, and they earn some money, they learn the techniques, and then they eventually could go in and kind of implement it in their own housing conditions. And I think this is like to find this trigger point, and also then the techniques to scale it down is then the next step. That is, I think, very important, and that has both stages has same kind of importance. But I think to start with a kind of a acupunctural trigger point is a good thing.
I like this massage and acupuncture analogy. It's very therapeutic, you know.
Actually, the structure that we did in front of the gun hall, that was also really good. I had a friend of mine who is an earth architect in China, and he said someone came by, a tourist from China, and he saw this, and then he thought, hey, actually, I like that. And then he looked around in China for an architect who could do it, and then hired him and got a project implemented. So that was kind of also a trigger point here.
Any other questions?
Hi, Andres.
Hi. Since you started working with mud, have you seen the industry change or be receptive to this shift? I mean, from architects to foundations and awards to also just the industry. You mentioned some prefabrication that has been going on with Ricola, for instance. So can you talk a little bit about where we're going? Is it getting better, or is it?
I think what's interesting is the brick industry, because they are really afraid of this carbon taxes things. So they know, I mean, to fire the clay, you need this energy, and that just sets free a certain amount of carbon emissions. To get rid of it, the only thing is to use the raw material, the clay. So they are, I think that this is the kind of industry that is more perceptive for it, because it's the same material, kind of. But the concrete is a bit more tricky. I mean, like, there's always this search for green concrete. I mean, green concrete is rammed earth. You know, it's like the same ingredients as you have the gravel, and then instead of adding the cement as a glue, you have the clay as a glue. So this is the green concrete. But you know, with firing and now in the cement production, firing the waste, you know, the whatever. So it's kind of, you can trick it in a way that the carbon emissions that are in the waste are calculated in the waste. So if you fire the waste, you're having zero carbon emissions because it has been calculated already on the other side. So this is kind of where they could probably find a bypass to overcome this kind of carbon certificates in a way. But I think the brick industry, they can't do, because they need this very good primary energy, and that's what causes the CO2 emissions. So I think that's probably the industry that is most interested.
Okay, thank you again for a great talk.
Thank you.